But I've been asked to kind of open up with a few comments around the theme, which is I don't do politics, and lots of us would have heard people say something similar. Actually, I've heard people say not just similar, but actually with a few expletives thrown in as well, because it's really one of those things now, I think, where politics is almost a kind of dirty word with a lot of people. But I think when you look at some of recent examples about what happens when politics really does talk to people, how people do really get engaged in that, I think it speaks volumes. So you look at Scotland, for example, and I know it's an example that a lot of people are pointing at the moment, but I don't think you can just ignore 80-something% of an electorate taking part in a process that was, they felt, obviously was really, really important for them. One of the things for me that I find really important about that was the energy that generated amongst young people as well. At whatever side of the argument people were on, it was just a massive engagement in the political process and a massive engagement of young people. And I'll not forget one of the things that I was told by one of our members up there, who was actually on the polling station that had 100%. Now, I mean, I don't know if that's unprecedented in the UK, but it's unprecedented to my knowledge, where what they told me was they'd gone through the whole, because you kind of cross people off as you go through on the electoral register when they voted. And they knew the one person who hadn't voted, and they were waiting for him outside, because everyone's just, where is he? We want to close the thing, apart from anything else. But where is this person? But the fact that 100% of an electorate of a polling station district all participated, I just think is incredible. So it seems to me the challenge then for all of us is, well, how are we going to get the maximum amount of participation in not only the general election that's to come up, but also local elections. Local elections, notoriously small participation in those elections. Whatever political persuasion you have, we all want to see people participate, I'm sure, in the electoral process. And the general election, whilst usually has a higher level of participation, I think I'm right in saying even that's been falling off nationally lately as well from the levels that it's been at. I mean, I remember, I'm a historian, I remember reading stories about mass meetings in the run-up to elections with politicians. You call a public meeting to talk about the issues around an election, like hundreds of people, thousands in some cases, in some of the big cities, were turning up to those elections. So what I wanted to just try and explore tonight, really, is, well, what maybe needs to be done differently to try and engage people, but what are some of those key issues that need to be addressed? Because people don't just turn up just for the sake of it. I think the lesson of Scotland is people turned up because there was an issue there that they felt really, really strongly about, that engaged them, that they felt could make a real difference by them going out and voting. And that's where I kind of want to start tonight, really, is thinking about that. And obviously, I mean, I'll be giving everybody an opportunity to ask questions around some of the key issues that we face at the minute. But I think when we start with the question, I don't do politics, and you have two eminent politicians with us, I think the first question has to be, well, why did you get involved? I mean, maybe, let's start with you, Jeremy. I mean, why did you get involved in politics?
I suppose I got involved in politics because I could see how important it was. I remember the first general election I took any interest in was 1970, when Ted Heath became Prime Minister. And it was interesting because I was 11 at the time, and it was a change of government, so it was the first change of government that I'd been aware of. I didn't have any particular political leanings at that age, but I could see that it was of interest to my parents. And then there was the, I suppose what really captivated me about politics was, interestingly, was partly having to do my O-levels, build up to some of my O-levels during the power cuts of 1973 and 74, and you could see what was going on in the country at that time. It was a very difficult time for the UK. But also Richard Nixon, you remember his impeachment in 1974. We happened to have a teacher at school who was very interested in politics, and particularly US politics, and had followed the Nixon impeachment and almost gave us a day-to-day commentary on what was happening there. So I still remember where I was when Richard Nixon resigned. I'm not at the age to remember where I was when JFK was assassinated, but I do remember I was in Paris on holiday with my parents the day that Nixon resigned, and that to me was a seminal political event, because he was the most powerful person in the world who had to step down because of wrongdoing, and in a sense proved that politics was working, that somebody who had lied, covered up, deceived, couldn't go on in the position of the most powerful person in the world. And then I suppose I remember we had a very good general studies program in school. I remember Dennis Healy's wife coming to talk to us. I remember Roy Hattersley's wife coming to talk to us. She was headmistress in the local area. I remember I went to...
Where was that?
At Highgate School. I remember it was an independent school, and I remember going to a meeting with her afterwards, and she'd given a speech saying how independent school should be abolished, and all the other sixth formers I was with were saying, yes, that's a good idea. And I said, hang on, you're here in an independent school, you want it to be abolished? And they said, yes. And I said, well, you come from wealthy families, you've paid to come here, now you want it abolished. I come from a family where my parents had very little, but they decided to put what they did into my education because the local alternatives weren't good as far as they could see. And so there was always that political interest. I then was engaged in politics at the university a little bit. And then I sort of slightly went off the rails. You may say go on the rails, because I went to Peru to visit some missionary friends of mine up in the Andes, and then went to Lima, and this was in the early 80s, and saw the huge poverty and the barriers around Lima. And so when I got back, I thought the then Conservative government was doing nothing about poverty, so I started attending local Labour Party meetings in Hornsey Labour Party. Unfortunately,
when was that? That was in Hornsey Labour.
Well, this was early 1980s, and unfortunately, there wasn't any interest no interest there either in international development at the time, which was a pity. It was much more about process, about what was going on locally. So in the end, I joined the Liberal Party and stayed there for a while. And then I went and worked overseas and lost most contact with British politics. But you can see I've had a fairly checkered and mixed political history, but it's been always something that I've had a keen interest in. So even when I lived in Tanzania, which was a one-party state, and I couldn't take any part in politics, I was interested in what was going on there, and I got involved in business politics, helping to set up trade associations and so on.
Come back to some of that.
Yeah.
What about you, Mike?
Well, I suppose I came from a family that had always traditionally been interested in politics, and I think that helped in terms of my growth into the subject, because both my parents have been involved themselves in the Conservative Party back in the 1930s onwards. And I suppose, you do take something from your parents. I then, obviously, myself, got involved at school. We had a debating society. It was the grammar school here in Stafford. We had a debating society, and I joined that. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. And we had debates on non-political topics mainly, but we did occasionally have debates on political topics. And obviously there were some people of like-minded views to me in terms of politics. And we sort of got it then, decided as a group of us, about 4 of us, we would join the local Young Conservatives. So that's how I got actually into the Young Conservatives, and I was actually illegally a member because I was only 15 and you were supposed to be 16, but anyway, that's it. And that is actually...
So did we kind of know that before, while you were on the council?
No. And I joined at that, and that will, next year, that will be 50 years ago. So I've been a member for 50 years next year. But when I went to university, I think we have to understand my sort of era. And obviously this is a mixed group here in terms of ages, but politics, I think, at that time was very much more polarised than it is now. And I think people did tend to sit in generally one of two camps. Not you know, there were people in the middle of the scene, either to the left or to the right. But it was very much a more polarised thing. And whilst I was at university, I was asked to go to, because I got involved there with the local Conservative students' organisation, I was asked to go to a youth conference in Berlin. And I think that the seminal moment, a bit like Jeremy for me, was actually standing on the Berlin Wall, because to me that wall epitomised the difference between socialism and capitalism. And you know, there was the choice, and it was very important to me, that, and I often think back to it. Obviously then I continued, when I finished university, I came back to Stafford to live, and continued with my interest. And a very senior sort of member of the council came to talk to us about council. And in the bar afterwards, aren't most things arranged in the bar afterwards? But in the bar afterwards, he said, well, would you like to stand for the council? Now, I was only 24 years old then. I hadn't ever thought about being involved in local politics at all. And so, anyway, the following meeting, I said to all the young Conservatives there, I said, this chap had asked me to stand. Oh, we think that would be great. We'd all come out and help you. So I said, oh, that sounds good. Thinking I'd probably get the worst seat in the whole council to fight. And I was amazed when they rang me up and said, would I like to put my name for a particular seat, where I now live and have lived for many years anyway. And so I was put up and I was elected. So in a sense, it was a natural, for me, it was a sort of natural progression from obviously parents through to my own views. I mean, at university I was a member of the Students' Union. I got elected to the Students' Union at the university. That was very interesting because politics there was even more polarised in a sense. And I think there was only one or two of us from the right of the political spectrum on the Students' Union. It was the times of the great sit-ins and one thing and the other. It was quite a heady time, you know, late 1960s and early 1970s. And of course, we had all the trouble that you talked about with Ted Heath and the unions and the whole thing at that time. So it was a very exciting situation, really. Politics for me was exciting then. And I think we're going to go on, aren't we, a bit later on as to why things are as they are now. But it isn't as exciting now, because the polarisation isn't there. Now, I'm not saying that's bad.
Well, can I pick you up on that? Because, and maybe you can both comment on that, because I think there is a kind of school of thought, maybe, that says that actually it is quite polarised at the moment. Because you know, stats that I see tell me that there's a group of people who are getting richer, and there's a group of people who are not doing really well, in fact getting poorer, struggling to survive on food banks, having to really struggle to keep their head above the water, while there seems to be this kind of uber-rich group who are doing really, really well, who are really kind of prospering. So, I mean, maybe if you could both comment on that, maybe Jeremy, about, I mean, how you would see that, whether that polarisation still does exist, or maybe is it getting worse? Is it?
If I could come in on that, I think I understand exactly what you're saying, but I think it's slightly, I would characterise it differently. I would say, if you like, the uber rich exist, they always have existed, and there are a pretty small number of them. And I think they are so, that they have so many opportunities that they will do what they do. And yes, you, as a government, as a country, we have a responsibility to make sure that they fulfil their responsibilities if they're living in this country. And we have certainly a group of people in the country who are incredibly, who are very disadvantaged and who are really struggling. And then, but I think the vast majority of people in this country are somewhere in between that. And even people, it was interesting listening to a news report today, which was really saying that the middle class is almost dividing into two, between the people who are relatively comfortable and middle class who are finding it very difficult. You know, they may be able to make ends meet, but they're not able to make much in the way of savings. They haven't got much in the way of pension earnings. So I think the picture is slightly more nuanced than the sort of top and the bottom, much as the political debate has tended to, you know, focus on fat cat billionaires or millionaires and the people at the bottom. Absolutely, we should, as you know, politicians, and I'm Mike, I think you object to me saying so, very much one nation. The Conservatives, very much from the centre ground, believe we have an absolute responsibility to deal with poverty in this country and indeed around the world. But I think there's a real issue among assuming that everybody above that really difficult bottom line is somehow okay, and all, if you like, the middle class are all in it, you know, all together, and they're all surviving. Actually, there's a there's quite a lot of segments within that group, and I'm sure that UNISON is very, very well aware of that, because you will represent a lot of those people who are, yes, on paper, they're earning average earnings, they're doing okay, but actually it's still pretty tough.
Well, what we're seeing is that there's a kind of, I think it's what's called a hollowing out of the economy. So you'll see a group of people doing relatively well. On top of that, the uber rich, but you know, you've got some people who are doing relatively well. You've got a whole bunch of what used to be the kind of middle managers being those jobs disappearing from the economy. And I understand why. It's because of the cuts that have taken place, which we'll come on to a bit later on. But a lot of the cuts that have taken place, a lot of effort's gone into defending the kind of frontline services. And I know councils of all persuasions have really tried to do that. Some more successfully than others, but a lot have tried to do that. But those middle manager jobs, not just public sector, but also private sector, those jobs are gone. And those were what some people would call the middle class jobs. So you've got a whole bunch of people there who used to be doing those jobs and were kind of okay, doing all right, where they're kind of the jobs that they would have expected to go into have gone. So I mean, I agree with you. I think there's a real issue there about what happens to that kind of strata of the economy. Because one of the things that we see for us, that was a strong part of our membership, just in public service delivery. And a lot of not all, but a lot of people from that strata have gone on to self-employment as well. And again, we've seen over the years what's happened with self-employment. Some people are more successful than others. That's the nature of it, I think. So I think there's a real change going on around the economy. But what a lot of the people that I represent see is that there are a lot of people who are really, really struggling. Just really struggling, just even with jobs, you know, not unemployed, but with jobs, having to do 2 or 3 jobs just to get by. And that's the kind of tricky bit when they see that there's some people who are doing, you know, okay. some groups come in and try and create divisions and say that, well, this is all the fault of immigrants or whatever. And you know, it's an easy target, but wrong in my view. So I mean, I just think there's some interesting things going on around the economy that is useful just to get out.
Well, we started this off with polarisation. And I don't agree with your analysis, you see. And whilst I agree with it, you know, totally about the analysis of the uber rich and middle range and so on, I don't actually see that dividing in political terms, because we're talking about politics here. And I don't think there is the same buy-in by all groups across all spectrums actually into the political side. They don't actually see, and this must be the fault of politicians, but they don't actually see that their vote makes much difference to what actually happens. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges really that we face. Now, the problem now is we are getting certain political parties that are particularly, you know, attracting support on the basis of extreme things, because that they see as the way to attract these people who really feel a bit disconnected from the system. And I think that is the challenge that, if you like, the moderate thinkers within the country face, because you do then have to try and make sure, if you like, that political support is retained. And the danger is for you to move along that path towards these extreme ends, whichever side it be. And I think that is a very dangerous development that's happening now. And I think that is the big difference now in terms of politics. I mean, in terms of the uber rich and all that analysis, the danger we face is how do we actually create wealth in the country? And all these things come to that process. I mean, Churchill is being talked about at the moment, a very controversial person really in some ways, but he did have this idea of the safety net, which I think is the right approach to it, that you can go as high as you like, but there should always therefore be the safety net at the bottom to catch those people who are, you know, struggling and need help. And I certainly, and as Jeremy said, we are both on that sort of, if you like, wing of the Conservative Party, which believes very passionately in help. Europe, a lot of this comes through the Christian parties, in you know, and that certainly comes through with me. That is why I'm very much in support of that. It comes from my basic religious beliefs, which is rather interesting really. The two do come together there. They say you should never mix them, but I always have, and I've always felt that the two things can work together.
I'm going to bring some people in. I mean, if anyone's got any questions or contributions to make just to help the discussion along. Anybody at the minute? I'm going to take hands as I see them. Could you, anybody who wants to make, could you introduce yourself as well first, please?
David Marsden. I'm a caseworker with UNISON, I'll admit it now, and used to be assistant branch secretary here. So Jeremy and I have met once or twice. Mike, you spoke a few moments ago about how politicians perhaps don't seem to represent the electorate in the way that they used to. And I wondered what your thoughts, both of you, were on the existence of what people refer to as a political class of, for the sake of argument, and forgive me, middle-aged white men in suits, which is the image that people have of politicians these days. There's a very narrow range of people who get into politics as a profession. What do you think on that score?
I think it's a valid perception. I don't think it's entirely represents the reality. It's interesting that the backgrounds of members of Parliament, including the majority who are, as you rightly say, are white men in suits, is incredibly different. So if you go into people's backgrounds, on Conservative benches or indeed on Labour benches, you'll find a lot of people who actually have had a lot of experience in areas completely outside of politics for many, many years. I mean, I find it, I was elected to Parliament when I was 50. I've only been really actively involved in politics since I was in elected capacity since I was in my mid-40s, and spent most of my life in the business world and doing a lot of other things. So I tend to see myself as somebody who's been in politics but having had a career outside, and maybe in future as well. So there is a lot of varied experience there. But there is undoubtedly a Westminster class, and it goes across the parties, and it tends to be about people who are very good at doing the politics, if you like, performing in the House of Commons. So we have, if I take the people who hold the highest offices on both sides at the moment, they tended to have a very political career. They tended to have known the right people. They tended to have been in the House of Commons. They know how to speak well. They have all those things that maybe we don't, who've only come into it fairly late on. And the way that people are promoted within politics or get into positions of authority in politics is, in my view, completely dysfunctional. So you are expected to toe the line. I mean, I voted against my party's whip fairly early on in the Parliament, and I was taken aside and told that was it, you know. I mean, literally, I won't say by whom. Now, I'm quite glad I've got enough on my plate to work for the people of Stafford, so I didn't want particularly any other responsibilities. But it's interesting that you can be written off at such an early stage, and you see people on the other side who actually were written off. You know, people like Frank Field, who I think I have a huge respect for, and yet he was written off very early in the last government because he tended to think for himself. So I always remember that Gilbert and Sullivan song about the chap who rose to the top, because he always voted at his party's call and never thought of thinking for himself at all. Now, that's not fair to a lot of the people in government. There are some very good thinkers and some pretty independent ones. But the Westminster system tends to keep independent thought at a lower level than perhaps it ought to be. I think that's changing. If I look across the parties at the moment, I do think that people are not prepared, and you might want to ask me one or two questions about our own policies on, for instance, trade unions, and you'll see what answers you get from me. So you might want, I think there are people who are prepared to think outside and not prepared just to say, this is what the people on high have developed. And by the way, they didn't discuss it with you when they developed it, but they expect you to then spout it in public. I'm afraid that's not washing anymore. But the perception from the public is that it is very much people like me or Mike, we're all the same, we all think the same, we've all got the same backgrounds even though we haven't, and we all talk the same platitudes.
So, I mean, that's really, really interesting. I mean, it's a local council level. Then. I mean,
Yeah.
Is that broadly the same sort of thing, the way you
No,
say it?
no, I would say, being blunt about it, I think at local council level, it's mainly a place for people in their retirement. I mean, if you actually look at most councils, you will find that at least 60 to 70% of the members are retired. It's a sadness, and I have been very fortunate in my life because I was self-employed. I was able to undertake a council career. It is very, very difficult to get certainly into the senior reaches of running a local authority if you have what might be described as a traditional 9-to-5 job, because there are meetings during the day, particularly the county council. I have never been able to stand for the county council because I could never have kept up with the number of meetings required during the day to keep in with my work. So you do have this unfortunate situation that a lot of the councillors are retired. Now, it's certainly not balanced. I mean, we've had on the council in my time probably half a dozen people who've sort of been under 40, and I mean that, and that's in 30 years. It's not good in terms of balance, and again, relating, as you said before, relating to the public, because, you know, people go to a meeting, say that one of the few things that people get really revved up about, of course, is planning, and the planning committee. And you go to the planning committee and you sit down and you turn up there to see local government in action. And what do you see? A group of 65 plus people making a decision on whatever's before. So it is slightly different, the disconnect, in my opinion, in local government than it is in national government, because they do have a reasonable balance of age. I think it probably does still end at the upper end in Parliament, but there is a reasonable balance. What you do have in local government, though, is a very big reserve because of those people. They have done all sorts of things. There are certainly more women in local government, I think, than there are in Parliament as a percentage, although, no, actually on that might be, we're probably sticking where we were, whereas I think Parliament is making more advances, but it's still not by any means fair balance. And I think that's another aspect that does need attention, really.
I mean, if I just take an example, when I was a borough councillor in Newcastle-on-Lyme, I said, why can't we have council meetings on Saturday mornings? Because I work all the time. We have our meetings at 7 o'clock when I want to be putting my children to bed, because that's the age I was then. But no, they had to be at that time. One of the reasons they couldn't be on Saturday mornings was the council officers didn't want to come in on Saturday to run the meetings. So we tend to, if we want people to be involved in politics, we've got to make the politics and the hours fit them. In Parliament, we've changed the hours slightly to be more family friendly, but they're still not very family friendly. And Parliament also, anyway, as an institution, is not friendly towards people with young children at all.
What is it? Can I just follow up? I'll bring you in a minute.
No, sorry.
I promise. But one of the things that you said there was about making politics kind of fit in with what people need. I mean, one of the big debates is about how we vote in this country. So a Thursday, basically. So depending on the time depends on what election it is, basically. So what about Saturday voting? What about electronic voting? I mean, would you both of you be in favour of that sort of change to allow more people to take part?
I would have no problem with Saturday voting or even Sunday voting, as happens in many places. Electronic voting I'm not so keen on for two reasons. Partly, I am not convinced on the efficacy, on how trustworthy it can be. I'm sure eventually it could be. But more important, I do think that the act of going to a polling station and making a vote, certainly for a general election and possibly for local elections, making your vote or at least doing a postal ballot is very significant. And I think that is part of democracy. I remember when Tanzania had its first multi-party elections in 1995, the queues of people going to cast their vote, waiting 6 hours. You remember the multi-party elections in South Africa in 1994, the same thing. It's very important. Had people just been texting their votes in or doing something from a computer at home, I don't think it would have had that much significance, but maybe I'm old-fashioned.
But the circumstances are different, aren't they? You know, I mean, those were countries that were coming out of different difficulties, but real difficulties nevertheless. I mean, here we're talking about a situation where we used to have for general elections regularly turnouts 60%.
No, 80.
No, in the old days.
80+%. And in Stafford last time we had over 70, so...
So these are huge turnouts,
Yeah.
but in a lot of places in this country now, people are turning off from politics. So
I agree with you in a way.
Hang on a sec, hang on.
So
I'm trying to find ways of dealing with this question really about people who don't do politics.
Yeah.
Is there something else that we could do that just gives people more opportunity to get engaged in the voting? I understand that the political process is different, you know. Being engaged in politics is different to just voting. I know that, which is a whole different debate probably, or maybe a whole big part of this debate, perhaps. But I'm just trying to think through. Well, these are some of the things that have been floating around the ether for a little while, aren't they? About should we do things differently? A lot's been done in Parliament about doing, these all-night sitting things have kind of disappeared, haven't they? So,
I think there has been a move. It's probably not as far as it should be yet. I mean, a lot of these things like online petitioning, I think is a good aspect that's come in, because you do then get a flavour. They can be misused, but you do get a flavour. I mean, there's been talk of should we actually have some sort of method of sort of having mini referendums almost, on topics done electronically. I mean, that may, 30, 40 years from now, be something that probably people will accept, but I think it's just a bit too far as we are at the moment. Jeremy and I did not discuss any of this before we came in today, but funnily enough, I am absolutely 100% with him in terms of the actual voting. I think it should be some sort of formal process. I worry actually about postal voting even, because I'm not certain it's totally secure in the way it's done at the moment. And there's been quite a lot of abuse we've seen of the postal voting system. And it does worry me, that does. It was at one time, I mean, very difficult to get a postal vote actually. You had to get a doctor to sign, or you had to get your employer to sign to say you were going to be away before you could get a postal vote. Now you can have a postal vote as of right. I don't know, I personally like the old system where it made people go actually to the station to vote, because there is a system that is very, very difficult to corrupt, the way we conduct our elections. And personation is probably the only thing that could that we probably don't check very much of. And that's mainly because this country, they won't have an identity card, which I frankly would like. And I know I'm against my own party's view on all this, but I think there's an awful lot in this country could be sorted out with identity cards, in terms of fraud and all sorts of things. But I'm afraid it's not terribly libertarian. But what, I'm sorry, I'm going in a ramble. But I do like the concept of the vote being very important and very formal. And I think that some of the things you talked about would make it perhaps even cheapen it, if you like, and not make people feel it's that important. So it's a very difficult balance to draw.
Well, the conversations have moved on from some points I wanted to put on, but put towards. But as regards to people voting, I mean, I love to talk to people and speak about politics at dinner parties and various things. And just lately, I've engaged with young people and tried to talk about politics to them. Young people are in their mid-20s, and their ideas of what various parties stand for, whether it's Liberals, Conservative, Labour, UKIP, they just have airy-fairy ideas, and they're totally, a lot of them are misconstrued ideas, and I really feel, although they had the vote for 16 years for young adults from 16 to 18 were allowed to vote in Scotland. A lot of them were really voting, I personally feel, with their heart and not with their heads. And to allow people to vote that young is completely wrong. We're not going to see people in this country who are in their mid-20s, and you made them force, you forced them to vote, would be totally wrong. If people, to me, if they haven't got much of an idea of what politics is about, and they just vote because somebody's good looking or they like that person, the way they talk, is completely wrong.
Is that got anything to do with age though? That bit of it, where people are at the moment. I mean, it seems to me this thing of the beauty contest in politics is a really big issue for me. That you've got to dress right, you've got to look right, you can't, you've got to have a certain kind of image. It seems to be electable, which is a word that keeps being thrown out there. And to me, that's being sucked into that perception hasn't really got very much to do with age, because I come across people all the time, across a whole spread of ages,
Yes.
who kind of get sucked into that stuff when it's all about how you look on the TV, not about what you say, not really bothered about that too much. And I see quite a bit of that, so I mean I understand what you're saying, but I'm just wondering whether there's just something more involved in that. Do you want to
Expanding on your point, does this not come back to the topics covered in general education? I'm only 30, I never even touched politics at school. I didn't know the difference between Conservative, Labour. I didn't know what boroughs councillors did, county councillors did, what public services were actually offered, the difference between local and general elections, how MPs work, the general, House of Lords, the differences.
Have a comfort break.
Yeah, sure.
It's a
Too
really
much
good word.
tea. Thank you very much for the tea.
We carry on anyway.
Absolutely, please do.
You're absolutely right.
Is politics not a topic that needs to be part of the general education?
I totally agree with you. Yesterday I was at Blessed William Howard's doing year 7 and year 8 on politics, just talking about Parliament, talking about various issues, how democracy has evolved. We didn't have enough time to discuss major current issues, although we touched upon them. And we need to do much more of that. I have done that at various of the schools. And there was a lot of interest in it. The questions I got and the answers that people gave me to the questions I put were on the ball in both the year 7 and year 8. And I do a lot in primary schools as well, and I find it fascinating when we get them up to Westminster, and we have very good question and answer sessions. So I think we need to do a lot more. I think politics needs to be absolutely at the heart of the curriculum as part of citizenship and taken seriously. And we shouldn't be shy away from party politics as long as it's presented in a reasoned and sensible manner, and not a sort of a very, very adversarial manner which puts young people off, or puts most people off. So I think that kind of stuff, as I go back to the general studies lectures I had at school, they were excellent. We were fortunate that we were able to get very good people in, and we had a lot of a lot of the general studies stuff we had was politics, and was quite party political from various of the parties. So yes, you're absolutely right. And I think too, when the work that I do with schools here, there are a lot of issues which young people are very engaged in. I remember last year we did some work with on FGM with some young ladies from King Edward's School, and in the end they raised money for a women's refuge in Tanzania. They came to Parliament, they presented in Parliament. It was their idea, and they took it all the way, and that they really made that they were interested in that. And there are a lot of single issues, what's sometimes perhaps naively referred to as single issues, around the environment, around poverty, around housing, which really young people are absolutely involved in and interested in and want to influence. So I would go back, I absolutely agree with you. I think we do far too little, and I encourage local schools. I have to wait for their invitation. I encourage them to invite people in to talk about politics and to really engage.
I agree totally with that. I think that what engages people is often an issue that we as politicians never see on the radar at all. And And I think that that is our failing in part, but it's also the failing of the system, because, like Jeremy, I was fortunate, you know, in my A-level studies, I did A-level general studies, and the headmaster, rather bravely at our school, had all the sixth form in over a period of time. And we were just allowed to ask questions on politics, on economics, on social matters. And, you know, these things were debated. And I think that a lot of schools just do not do any of that. I used to, when I was a counsellor 20 odd years ago, that I was invited round, and I encourage it. I go to my local schools and introduce myself and say hello to the head teacher when they change and all that sort of thing. And I used to get invited in on courses that they had on civics, but they seem to have disappeared out of the curriculum. Whether, again, it's this pressure of, you know, you've got to have so much on the curriculum, you can't have other things, I don't know. But we are missing out by not having that.
See, I mean, we've experienced this as well as trade unionists, because 20, 25 years ago, I remember regularly going into schools to talk about the world of work, and about the role that trade unions have in the world of work. I mean, in that sort of time, there's a lot more trade union members around. I mean, there's still 7 million of us, but then we were talking about 10, 12 million invited into schools to talk about what was happening, some of the big issues. Now it's kind of few and far between when we get the chance to go in, and when we do, it's kind of tagged on at the end of something else.
Yes.
And there's no way of being able to develop a context and a conversation about, well, why do 7 million people still feel that it's important to be members of a trade union? Why is it different to what it was in the early 70s now? What's the difference in the makeup of trade union members? The majority of trade union members in this country are women now, and have been for the last 5 years or more. That is not a situation that existed when we were talking about the early 70s. You know, very heavy industry, mining, steel, you know, I mean, all those kind of industries, car making, heavily male, but that's not what we're talking about now. It's a whole different ballgame. Trade unionism in the UK is really public service at the moment. Our union, we're just under 1.3 million out of a TUC membership of, you know, 7 million. So, you know, it's a large proportion of public sector. And yet we see a diminishing of the number of public sector workers employed directly by public service employers, but interestingly, an increase in the number of people who deliver public services, you know, but employed by the private sector or community and voluntary sector. So it's, you know, massive change in the way that work is organised, but we don't get a chance to go and talk with people about how things change, and I just think that's a gap.
I agree. I think trade unions should be invited into schools and go into schools, along with MPs and councillors and other people who are involved in civic life. Absolutely, and I think it's very important. You play a very, very important role.
Thank you. Got two questions. Can I ask one, and I'll wait again later for the second.
Yeah, sure.
Is the whipping system a denial of democracy?
Yes and no, a typical politician's answer, I suppose you might say. It is, in the sense that when you are elected to represent your constituents. You stand for a particular political party, you stand on a broad platform, and therefore the party which supported you, which you supported, has a right to expect that you will cast your votes roughly in accordance with the general principles on which you stood, otherwise you should not have stood for that party. However, the whipping system has got ridiculous in the sense that I believe three-line whips should be used very rarely. Three-line whips are the ones where if you vote the wrong way, you're in trouble. I've already referred to one occasion. That should never have been a 3-line whip. And a number of others where I've voted against the 3-line whip, in my view, should not have been 3-line whips. They should be reserved for places, for votes where this is really at the heart of your government's policy, and not issues which were neither in the manifesto or were only peripheral to the manifesto. So there, I think the whipping system is far too heavy, and in fact, it's beginning to be almost disregarded. I mean, this Parliament has been, in inverted commas, the most disloyal of any Parliament in living memory in the number of people on both sides, in particular on the Conservative side, not the government side, but actually on the opposition side as well, who just disregarded their whips. And the power that the whips have is diminished simply because so many members of Parliament now are not particularly ambitious. The only power a whip has got over you is if you want to become a minister, if you want promotion, or if you don't want to get deselected by your party. But in my party, it's the local associations who select you, and they don't mind. In fact, they expect their member of Parliament to have an independent mind. Certainly here in Stafford they do. And if they're not bothered about, the member of Parliament is not bothered about whether they are promoted or not, then the whip has less power. So I think we're beginning to see, I hope, a real weakening of that. But you have to have a core of whipping to ensure that a government gets its programme. And as I say, if you stand on a general policy that, for instance, the deficit needs to be reduced or eliminated, then it's up to you to vote in accordance with that, because that was such a major plank of your manifesto.
So Mike, I mean, you were leader of a council, this council,
Yeah.
or borough council.
Yeah.
Could you survive without a heavy whip?
Well, we do actually survive without a heavy whip, because the arrangements we have are certainly much looser than they have in Parliament. Certainly in our group, the Conservative group, that you are permitted to vote against even a majority decision of the group, as long as you give notice, and as long as it's really either a ward issue or an ethical issue. Now you might wonder, what on earth, what sort of would be an ethical issue? Well, I'll give you one, because I actually voted against, as leader, I voted against my group over, believe it or not, the granting of a casino licence, because I didn't believe we should allow casinos. I have an ethical problem with that. I know it's an amazing one, but I mean, it's amazing how things can get into such small detail. But certainly that was an issue. So, but we generally do get the business through, and if people have told you in advance what they're going to do, you can appropriately plan for it. So I've never really had an issue with members, exercising independence where it's appropriate. I think the issue is, and Jeremy's quite right, I would not tolerate, as a leader, someone voting against the council budget that we'd spent months and months and months getting to, and everybody had been involved in, the group as a whole. Because, again, there's a slight difference in council, in that the whole group is actually involved in the decision making. In government, ministers can make decisions which I'm afraid the troops generally have to follow, whether they had any input into them or not. Whereas I think in council, I think you're a very foolish leader if you take anything through to the council that you haven't had a discussion with your group about. So it's not quite so polarised. I do get angry with some of my members when they vote the wrong way, when they haven't given notice, and there are one or two times they've done that. And I ask them why they've done that, because that is discourteous to me. It's actually about discourtesy to me, that is, because they have the opportunity of saying, I'm going to vote this way. They don't. and then they go and do it. And then I do get angry about that.
I mean, I'll bring you in a minute, Steve, and I'll not forget.
Quick supplementary.
Yeah,
goes into
hang on,
this.
let me just make this point first, because it will be, I hope this adds to the discussion, but I used to be a chief whip in a major, London Borough of Islington many years ago now, and we faced this issue very, very often in the Labour group that I was whipping for, where there was a group that pretty much always voted against. Now, on some of those, I would basically build in to the equation, because we had a majority, so I'd always kind of build in. If we were going to win anyway, then frankly I'd take a decision about what I was going to do with the kind of usual suspects, really, who are always going to, I think, be disrespectful to the discussions that had taken place within the party and within the Labour group about the way that we were going to do things, and they had lost the votes and yet still decided they were going to ignore that. And for me, that's just not the way you do business.
No, it isn't.
I kind of remember a trade union analogy to this, which was, again, goes back to the 1970s, where one of my heroes in the trade union movement was a guy called Jack Jones, and Jack was at the heart of the big debate that was taking place about the social contract, remember all that at the time, and Jack never ever lost a vote within his national executive in the Transport and General Workers Union. It just didn't happen. General secretaries in those days rarely did lose those votes. Jack certainly didn't. But he actually, they were having a conference, their national conference, and Jack lost the votes on what to do about the social contract. And then the next discussion was, well, who's going to go out to the conference and tell the delegates? And Jack was really annoyed about it. He said, well, I'm the General Secretary. It's my job to go out there, because I lost the votes, but I'm representing, you, so it's my job to go out and sell it like it was my idea. And the problem with all that is that Jack got denounced in the press afterwards for being a turncoat and going against. Actually, what he was doing was taking the view that he had a responsibility to the people who put him in place. And I think that's the way that I respond to it. I think it's absolutely honourable, and I think far too many people forget, they're kind of lone rangers actually, and forget you come from a democratic base that has decided how you're going to go about things. And we face this in the trade union movement every single day, actually. Do you want to bring your supplementary, and then I'll bring Steve in.
Supplementary. Rhetorical question.
Okay.
Who elects the MP? The party who puts them up, or the voters in the constituency?
Sorry?
Who elects the MP? The party that puts them up, or the voters in the constituency?
That's the eternal tension. And it's absolutely the people who elect you are the voters in the constituency, and your primary responsibility is to your constituents, whether they voted for you or not. However, we live in a party system. We are not 650 independents. I would not have got elected for Stafford in the last election as an independent. I got elected as a Conservative. So I have a responsibility because I stood on the Conservative manifesto, to represent those values broadly, as I say broadly, in Parliament, and that's what I have done. But I also have an absolute responsibility to my constituents, and there have been many issues, as we know, Paul, right throughout this Parliament, where that sometimes puts you at odds with some of the things that your party or your government may be doing, and that's where you've got to say, I'm sorry, this is not something with which I can agree, and therefore I'm going to take a different view, because this is too important for my constituents. So it's always a tension, and while we have a party-based system, which we have for many years, hundreds of years, decided is the most reasonable form of government, then that tension will continue to exist.
Jeremy said earlier that it was important that the deficit was reduced. I've got a question that was sent in to us, which has been asked to a number of people who've sat in those seats throughout this week. Which do you feel is more important, reducing the deficit or reducing the number of people relying on food banks?
It's a good question, and I would say both have got to be reduced, and I don't think it's an either or, and I'll tell you why. The deficit ultimately is about our future as a country. If we go on running a deficit which is unsustainable, we will end up with situations like Greece, where their health service budget has been cut by 15 to 20%, as opposed to ours, which has at least been maintained in real terms. And that would spread right across. You would get a situation where in Greece you have 50+% youth unemployment. In this country we have still far too high, but it's 18% or 19%, and in Stafford considerably lower than that. I believe that the thing about a deficit is ultimately it has to be financed. If it has to be financed, where does the money come from? How much interest do you have to pay? We are at the moment paying £50+ billion a year on interest. That will grow all the time as our deficit grows, and that's when interest rates are at historically low levels. On food banks, absolutely, we must. I helped to launch a report from Child Poverty Action Group, Oxfam, Trust in Parliament in November, and I have some disagreements with the government over one or two issues, particularly on things like sanctions from Job Centre Plus. I still think that they are enforced in a way which drives people to food banks when they shouldn't be. There are issues around housing benefit which can cause the same. There are crises that people come into and drive them to food banks, which I believe are unnecessary. And I think as a government, whoever is in government, has got to address this. I think food banks they perform in any situation, and they've been, for instance, in Germany, Canada, they've had food banks for a very long time. There will always be people who go through crises, even when the economic times are very positive and you have very little unemployment. There will always be people who go through that, and you will need a place for them to go to. But the level at which people are turning to them at the moment is far too high, and as a country and as a government, we need to focus absolutely on that.
I mean, I really don't have much to add to that, because I totally support what you've just said. I mean, I think that the point really is, if you lose control of your economy, and that is the problem in allowing, if we can put it this way, the deficit to run out of control. If you lose control of your economy, everything will go, and you will find that there will be much greater problems and much greater poverty, actually, in the long run as a result of that. So I think that the plan that we're on, I mean, to be frank, Britain has had a gentle, I know people won't agree with me, but we've actually had, relative to some other countries, a gentle reduction of our deficit compared to some places. I mean, I have some friends in Spain, one of whom is a teacher. Her pay has been cut by 25%. We never had anybody's pay cut by 25% as a result of trying to get their deficit under control. And I think that it is a balance. If you remember, one of the great debates in the early part of this Parliament was between, actually, obviously, the Labour and Conservative Party, about how far and how fast and so on. And it is a terribly difficult judgment. Get it wrong, try and reduce a deficit too quickly, and you will actually then really damage the economy by reducing demand and so on, and the whole thing will get out of control. Similarly, being too gentle and allowing debts to build up goes to the problem that Jeremy mentioned in terms of interest payments and all to the financial markets in the world, and we're not sovereign. We live in an economic world, and if we are written down in the economic world, we will find this will have terrible implications for jobs and growth within the economy. So at the end of the day, it's it's a delicate balance, and it's very, very hard to judge it. I'm going to make a controversial statement. Actually, between the two parties, we're not talking about big numbers anyway. I mean, you know, there's a lot of talk about this, but really they're playing around with 5 or 10 billion quid a year within the overall context of the British economy. And actually, I don't think either party really will let the thing get totally out of control. But it's really how far and how fast you go, and that is the real decision.
You answered a couple of other questions as well, I think.
I do, yeah. Stafford is a county town of Staffordshire, but services such as the hospital and university have either gone or are rapidly diminishing and being moved to Stoke. There is a huge increase in the amount of new housing being built in the town, so surely services should be maintained or increased and not decreased. How are you going to ensure that there is the access to the right services for the people of Stafford and the surrounding villages without them having to travel to and from Stoke?
Well, shall I address that one? And I'll start with health services. I think everybody here will know the history of the last few years and the campaigns that we've been having on the hospital and how some of them we won and some of them we haven't. 2 years ago, almost to this week, was produced a plan which said that Stafford wouldn't have a hospital without an accident and emergency, without acute services, very much diminished. A campaign was started, we all took part in that, and that has not happened. We have still got acute services, we've still got an accident and emergency department. We haven't got all we would like at all, in my opinion, and I will be continuing to push that, particularly for the restoration of 24/7 A&E. But even next week we are starting to have an overnight doctor-led service in the hospital, which is an improvement on where we are this week. It's not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. More fundamentally, what we are facing, and if we talk specifically about health, is a change in the way that health services are delivered. And this is not just about Stafford. You take a town like Loughborough. Okay, it's not a county town, but it's the same size as Stafford. Loughborough has a hospital without an accident and emergency, without acute services, with a couple of wards, and that's it. Now, the trend has been very much in health services to specialise over the last few years. Added to the European Working Time Directive, which has meant that the old firm system has changed to a rota system. You have had to have far more consultants on a rota, usually 8, minimum of 8 to cover a full-time rota, up to 10, whereas before you might have had 4. And therefore, the smaller hospitals cannot maintain some general rotas, let alone the specialist rotas. So if we want specialist medicine, and the general public seems to want that, if you want to know that you are going to have a specialist treating your heart attack with invasive cardiology, then it will have to be done in a large hospital, and that the London Hospital Services did that a few years ago with great results. Staffordshire has done the same. It's been done pretty much across the country on clinical evidence. So that is one driver, the specialisation. As I said, European Working Time Directive has been another driver, reducing the hours of clinicians. I remember when my wife was a junior doctor and was working 120 hours a week. That was totally unacceptable. It was dangerous. But we've now got to the stage where perhaps, in some ways, the pendulum has swung a little bit too far, and it's meant that it's almost impossible to run a lot of services in the smaller hospitals like Stafford that we all want to see as much as possible in. So where have we ended up? We've ended up, I think, in Stafford with a position, a base from which we can grow further because we've kept some of those critical services. We've kept a position in which at least 90% of patient attendances will be continued in Stafford, and that will probably grow. We've joined up with the Stoke Hospital within the University Hospital Trust. That means that we will have more people interchanging between the two sites. It means that we can eventually, although it'll take a time, begin to attract people who are wanting to come into a university hospital's environment. So I think there's some some real positives about that, and we shouldn't, while really continuing to campaign and fight on the various issues around maternity, paediatrics and accident emergency, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact of the services that have been retained and the investment that is going in. University, however, they are an independent body. They decided to do that. The one thing I was glad about was they didn't decide to close the department. They moved it 18 miles up the road to Stoke-on-Trent, so at least it keeps that department within Staffordshire. However, what we have got to do is try, as we already have begun to, encourage other universities to come in. Staffordshire University will maintain a small campus for its health department in Stafford. Keele University will increase its work in Stafford as part of the university hospital, of which we're now part. Wolverhampton University has established a small footprint in Stafford, and I hope will grow in Stafford. So I think there is a good opportunity here. I believe we will see quite a lot of higher education come into the town over the next few years, simply because it's becoming a very attractive place for people to invest, and they will ultimately want to see higher education alongside the commercial activity that's taking place. You quite rightly referred to the growth of Stafford and the surrounding area. If we put it into context, it's about 500 houses a year for the next 20 years across the borough. It's about 10,000 homes. So it's substantial. It will increase the population of the borough by probably 15%. And one of the reasons why we were able to maintain, to make the argument for maintaining, for instance, accident and emergency and acute services at Stafford was the growth. As I say, a town like Loughborough, which actually is pretty much the same size, didn't have those because it didn't have the number of people. By growing, we were able to justify having those services which might otherwise have been lost. Now, it's not an easy thing at all, an easy time, but I'm very hopeful about the future. Actually, I'm looking at I think the other thing we have to keep our eyes very closely on is the school and college situation. Again, we have some very good schools and colleges locally, but we could do better, and we need to really keep our eyes and make sure that we make the best of those schools and colleges locally.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeremy has analysed this exactly as I have. I mean, the situation is that it's disappointing, particularly the university decision. I think they've made the wrong decision. Because I think if you look, they are going to concentrate all their efforts on Stoke-on-Trent campus. If you look in this county as the areas that are going to grow, I'm afraid Stoke-on-Trent is not going to be the highest growth area within the county. Stafford could be, and I think that they have made a fundamental error in their planning. And it's quite interesting to see that, albeit at a pretty low level at the moment, but Wolverhampton University has already come in here and are recruiting students from here, and they are going to have some base of teaching here as well. It's not going to replace the 2,000 odd students that were up at the Beaconside campus, but it is a start, and I think they've recognised the fact that Stafford is on a growth pattern. It's not a heavy growth pattern, but it is a growth pattern. And I make no apology for that. I've certainly been a supporter of it, because I believe if you don't grow, you go backwards. And that's always the challenge. Because obviously a lot of people don't like housing growth because it can disturb communities and so on. And I do understand all that. But at the end of the day, if we just stay as a small county town without any forward movement, you will not, as Jeremy says, preserve the services. You'll actually go backwards, because the demographics of things today is that there is a demand for housing just simply driven by things like the changing patterns of family life and so on. So that at the end of the day, growth is important, and certainly we feel a reasonable level of growth, 500 houses a year, is fine and manageable. As far as looking ahead, we've had a commitment from our largest employer, Alstom, now to build a new purpose-built factory here. That's a sign of their commitment. We've got these major developments going on in the town centre, where very, very few town centres are having anything like the investment that we're having poured in at the moment in these new shopping developments that we're having. We've got the army coming, 1,100 service personnel and their families. So I'm very optimistic about Stafford and where it's going. I don't share the doom and gloom that the questioner has put in that respect of where Stafford is going. I am disappointed about the hospital and what's happened there, and it seems to me, and I've said it time and again, that we're almost being punished for the problems that we had a few years ago, and I don't think that's fair. And I think that, you know, we should have retained a full service at our hospital. But at the end of the day, Jeremy's right, there are pressures from the medical professionals that the size of hospital at Stafford was, we can't keep all the services in Stafford. I do understand that. But I do think we do deserve to have a 24/7 A&E, and I do think we should have an obstetric-led maternity service in Stafford. I'm passionate about those things, and we've been all... I mean, one of the great things actually about this debate on the hospital at council level, it has been that we have been completely united across party lines. It has not been something, and that's a positive I see. There's not been any sort of attempt to try and make what might be described as party political capital out of the situation at Stafford Hospital. And that's a tribute to my opposing parties, Labour and the independent group and so on, because they have not sought to make it a party political issue. Their interest has been in Stafford, and that's the best part of local government, in my opinion, where you can come together and fight a thing in a united way. And obviously, I don't think it'll rest like that in the national scene, because obviously that's inevitable. But that has been a very positive aspect of it. And we have achieved a lot, have we not, Jeremy, really, on the hospital, from the position, as you said, 2 years ago to where we are now. It's not all we want, but we have achieved quite a lot.
I mean, we're kind of moving towards the kind of conclusion of the discussion. So there's a couple of trade union related questions that I wanted to ask. And there's a lot of talk recently about strikes and about making it more difficult for people to strike. I would actually argue it's quite difficult for people to decide to go on strike anyway. But there's talk about new thresholds for people should meet before strike should be allowed, particularly in what's called essential public services. I mean, do you have a view?
Yeah, I do. And my view is, firstly, that I think we should have minimum standards for when there is, and they're fairly few and far between, but when there is a strike for an essential public service, minimum standards that are maintained for public safety, or the education of our children, hospitals, fire service. I went on record on BBC to congratulate the Fire Brigades Union for their approach to the strikes locally, particularly as one of them was at the time we had that terrible fire in the fireworks factory at Tilcon Avenue. And I respected the way that they managed that, despite it being a strike related to the dispute over pensions at the time. So I think we need to have that, and they need to be solid, and they need to be adhered to and respected. I have had problem with the way that the RMT has conducted some of its activity in London, where a very relatively small number of people can cause huge disruption to millions of people trying to get to work. And I do believe that they haven't shown huge responsibility there. But I think we've got enough legislation on trade unions as it is. I think, personally, I would like to see trade unions take some decisions themselves in their internal governance about what thresholds they set and have a discussion as to, we as a trade union think that we ought to have X% of our members voting in favour of something, and that should be an internal discussion with trade unions that they, because I think the public will greatly respect that.
We do.
Yeah, yeah.
We do those things.
So those kind of things should be more common across, because the public tends to think that there is, certainly in respect to things like the transport strikes in London, where it has a huge impact, that there is a very small number of people who are holding the city to ransom, and indeed in other places the country to ransom. But I am not, I know my party has proposed certain things on legally imposed thresholds. I wouldn't go down that route. I would go much more down the route of having agreed, guaranteed minimum services in the very unfortunate instance where a strike happens, which we want to avoid. But I wouldn't want to add to the existing legislation, which I believe has resulted in pretty low levels of strikes if you compare it with the 70s, 80s, even 90s. You know, we've got to have a bit of mutual respect between trade unions and political parties. You have a job to do, we have a job to do, and often they're not that different, actually.
I don't know what you put in that tea. I'm going to have to get I'll be back in a minute.
I mean, I think it's an interesting point about the kind of thresholds that we talk about all the time within unions anyway. I mean, when you look at the health disputes, that even though the strike was postponed from yesterday, I mean, there's a consultation taking place, and if people decide that they still, if they don't accept the latest offer that's on the ground, then there'll be another dispute, probably during the last part of February. But even with all the disputes that take place across the public services that we're involved in, there is always that discussion about minimum kind of protections. Our members are dedicated public service workers, and they don't want to put anybody in harm. I mean, they simply don't do that. So there is always that discussion about making sure that life and limb is kind of secure. There's always that discussion that takes place with the employers. So, I mean, we have no problem with that kind of view about just making sure that those discussions take place. But we certainly have a problem with yet more trade union legislation.
Well, I would say I would have a problem with that. It's certainly when it comes to getting even more into mandating minimum requirements. One argument I don't buy, actually, which has been thrown at us as a sort of, at this policy as an argument against, is, well, local councillors are elected with 20% of the vote, so what's the problem? I don't think that's a good argument to use, because when you're talking about the comparator would then be, well, if you're going to vote on strike action on the tube, you should have a ballot among all the travellers as well as the drivers. And therefore, because when you're talking about a council, you're talking about the whole electorate voting. So that's one argument that I don't think is a good argument. The argument I think is a good argument is that in a free country and a democracy, we should not be legislating more than we already have done over the internal workings of trade unions when they're, in my view, they're showing themselves generally to be responsible. Of course, as I say, I've raised one or two examples where I believe there should be more responsibility, but that's not a matter for legislation, that's a matter for unions to perhaps discuss among themselves, and for eventually possibly to look at their leadership and see, are you leading us in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, my experience in local government, certainly, and the very rare occasions when there has been a conflict, I think at district council level particularly, there is less, if you like, opportunity for conflict, but there have been obviously disagreements over pay and conditions and various things. I have had nothing but, if I can put it this way, responsible behaviour by the unions, and I have never had any cause to criticise what they've done. And indeed, when we've had the very, very odd occasion when we've had strikes, the very point you made was discussions took place over covering for any life-threatening or difficult things that were going to arise and how that would be dealt with. So in that respect, I am not as revved up. I think it is slightly different up here, if I may say, to the rather, I think it does seem to get a bit more polarised when it gets down to the southeast. I don't know whether that's correct or not. And Jeremy's highlighted that. And I suspect that's the reaction. The trouble with some of these things is they are knee-jerk reactions to things that have happened. And I think we should sometimes just pause and think, what are we doing? I mean, we are a free society, and we pride ourselves on being a free society. And there, in that, I actually believe that trade unions have a very important role within a free society. We only have to look back, 100 years or over 100 years ago, the sort of things that were going on. And trade unions were absolutely necessary to change the way things were organised. And I always felt that was very important. But they can abuse the power that they have, so can the employers and so on. So it is a balance, and I think on this particular question, I don't go for knee-jerk sort of reactions to things, and I think a bit of a pause and contemplation, and as Jeremy says, everybody, all parties, both trade unions and the employers, just need to think sometimes how they behave and possibly moderate their behaviour occasionally.
Can I thank you both very,
Excuse
very much.
me, my second question, very quickly.
No, you made your second question.
No, that was a supplementary.
I'm going. Is it really
It was
quick?
something Jeremy, if I may, something Jeremy said about the
but
performance of MPs in the House of Commons. Does he mean in terms of effectiveness or histrionics? And is it the histrionics which is causing the disaffection of the public with politics?
I think, yes, I think histrionics, interestingly, I think that there is an awful lot of good stuff that goes on in the House of Commons that people just never see, particularly in the committees, which are all-party committees, some of which I sit. But you're right, I think it is the histrionics and the lack of intelligence in some of the things that is said simply to get almost to create unnecessary division sometimes. I think that doesn't do us any service whatsoever.
Demeans the place.
It does, yes. So I try not to participate. I don't believe in saying something for the sake of it that you're told to say and you don't believe.
That's a strange comment from a politician.
Well,
it's the comment.
There you are.
I mean, at a council level, if I can put it that way, we don't have quite the same pressure the national politicians have, because they're under constant scrutiny. And so at council level, it doesn't really happen. As I've said on the hospital issue, as an example, we came together. Quite often there are votes, unanimous votes in the council. That would be impossible in Parliament almost, to have unanimous votes. And that's because whatever the issue is, it's for the good of Stafford we are there, and that's what we do. I have to say we do divide on some issues, on probably financial policy, on certain ways of organising things and so on. Yes, we do divide, but generally speaking, it is done all with the best of intentions. And I think that's the difference, you see, when it gets down to the national issue, it does become a bit too confrontational. I mean, the layout of the House of Commons doesn't help that really in a way, does it? In the sort of
interesting,
confrontational. You see, our council chamber is not like that. Our council chamber is a semicircular chamber, and I do sometimes think about that, you know, actually, I do worry sometimes when I see some of my members cozying quite close to the other parties, you know, as to whether in fact there's something going on. But no, but it is nice the way it all is set out. We use the county chamber actually, so it's a semicircular chamber. And I think the House doesn't help itself with that, because there is this confrontation thing. You've still got your lines on the floor where your swords were, and so on. And I do think that does have an impact in how it works.
I mean, I remember when I was regional secretary of UNISON in the West Midlands, I was part of the regional assembly. I was one of the vice chairs of the regional assembly. And one of the things I remember most about that whole experience was that it was actually quite often very difficult to know who was from what party, because there was that genuine thing about wanting to do the best for the West Midlands, and there was a lot of cooperation, a lot of joint working, and it actually did. I mean, I'm very partisan usually in my politics, but actually working there was a real experience for me, because people really did work together, and that kind of attitude that you've said about people having that view about this is for Stafford. There it was about this is for the region. We have to have a regional, collective regional view about the way forward. And I always found that really quite an important part of my job as the regional secretary. One of the best parts of my job actually was to be part of that kind of joint process with not just employers, of course, but it was also, rather not just councillors, it was with employers as well. Community organisations who were part of that. Really good guys. The whole new debate about regional government that we haven't got time for. So I really am going to thank you now, because I found that really interesting. And thank you very much for coming and joining us this evening.